everybody. Welcome to the quick lecture on service delivery models for special education. We're going to take a few minutes and look at how and where students receive special education services. Remember, when we're talking about special education services, we can be talking about a student with very mild disabilities all the way to a student with very severe disabilities. As you learned in IDEA, when studying that, all students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education. So we want to ask the question when we're looking at services, is one place better than the other? Let's take a look back and see where we have been and where we are now. So as you learned, in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. The main point in this is that all children are to be educated with children who are not handicapped. At the time, we used handicapped instead of disability. So that took us from students not being educated to students being brought into our general education campuses. They still were not necessarily in the classrooms, but they were on the same physical location. In the 1980s, we had something referred to as a regular education initiative. And what this did was this called for children with disabilities to be completely integrated into the educational experience. And as it says here, to achieve improved educational outcomes. So the implication here was that the education being given outside of the general education was not sufficient for all students, and that some students were being denied their appropriate education because of being in special education programs that were external to the general education. In 1997, we amended IDEA, and this was a huge piece because this changed us from talking about where. Remember, one was to get the students on the general education campus, then one was to get them in the general education classroom. Now, the amendment for IDEA was that the students would have access to the general education curriculum. I'll let you read all of this, but please pause to read it. Students now must have access to the general education curriculum. So that's a role of special education teachers to adapt and modify the general education curriculum. It is not a separate curriculum that students with disabilities get. And of course that varies depending on the appropriateness for each individual student. So let's take a look at what service delivery models are presently available. When I say service delivery models, I'm talking about how students receive extra services on top of what the general education school day would give them. So this is quite a long list. These are the services offered in our community and most communities for students who qualify under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to receive special education services. Okay. There's also a list of related services on the IEP. There's a lot of acronyms here. I'll just walk through a few of them. APE stands for Adaptive PE. AT stands for Assistive Technology. OT is Occupational Therapy. PT is Physical Therapy. So you see in this list and the previous one how many different professionals can be involved in special education. We have people with kinesiology backgrounds and adaptive PE. We have physical therapists, occupational therapists. Those are unique degrees of their own. We have educational technologists in the assistive technology. We have social workers, marriage and family counselors, and behavior specialists, all involved in the field of special education. So there's plenty of career opportunities. So the one term that I want to look at most closely is called specialized academic instruction. I'm hoping that you hear this term when you do your interviews, although it is a term that we are slowly moving to. We used to call classrooms special day classes, which you'll see the acronym SDC. And then we also used RSP, which stood for Resource Program. Now we're looking at something called specialized academic instruction, which is more focused on the individual child. The individual child receives the specialized services that are needed, and it's not necessarily the place that they go, the SDC class or the RSP program, but it's more a collection of services throughout the day that helps a student meet the educational standards. Some school districts use this term more than others. As you're familiar with this term, the least restrictive environment, you'll see on this triangle here, you can pause it to study it a bit, but we start with a non-public school. In Camarillo, we have Casa Pacifica. Special school, around here we have Phoenix, which serves students with emotional disorders, or Triton, which serves students with autism, all the way up to the general education classroom. Least restrictive environment being general education classroom, most restrictive being a non-public school like Casa Pacifica. So when we look at service delivery models, there are multiple ways to look at this. From full inclusion, where a student with disabilities is fully included in the general education classroom, getting varying levels of support, all the way down to where a student is 100% time in special education, possibly off campus. What is important to remember here is that the service delivery model is not equated by the disability. So sometimes students with severe disabilities are fully included and they have support throughout the day to get through the day with a modified curriculum. Likewise, sometimes a student with mild disabilities requires to be in a more restrictive environment in order to meet his or her academic needs. So just remember that the severity of disability does not equate the restrictiveness of the environment. It's dependent on the individual student needs. I'm going to skip this one. You guys can look at what it might look like for full inclusion there. These are some different terms about general education. Pull out is when a student is pulled into a separate placement. Pull or push in is when a special ed teacher goes into the classroom. Collaboration can be the general ed and special ed teacher working together. And adaptations and modifications are terms that you need to get used to. That's what happens when the general education curriculum is adapted or modified to meet the needs of our special education population. After listening to this lecture, I would like you to look at the materials on full inclusion and add a comment on our Google Doc about your opinion of full inclusion. You're going to be adding a pro and a con. So if you don't understand at this point what we mean by full inclusion, please go back and look. It's when a student is in the general education setting all day with different levels of support.